right. So Nancy, I'm going to need you to be my eyes if anyone types anything in the chat.
Sure.
So as Nancy mentioned, I have been gone for the past 4 months. I have been doing what we call a detail, which is like a temporary work assignment at another refuge to get some experience. So I've been at Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge up in the Twin Cities for the last 4 months. So today I'm going to talk about a little bit about Minnesota Valley, what they're like in normal times, so pre-COVID, and then things I did during my detail and kind of how they've adjusted in the times of COVID. So some of you have probably been to Minnesota Valley before, but it's a really unique refuge. So I've got a map of some of the units here on the screen. Actually, all of them didn't fit. There would be more down in the southwest corner there, but I spent most of my time up at the main visitor center, which is up in the top right corner, kind of where that plane and star is. So here's a look at what that looks like, just kind of on a Google map. So red dot is where I was. That's the Bloomington Visitor and Education Center. And then way down in the southwest corner where it says Henderson, that is the extent of the refuge. So if you do the math of this, that is a massive, massive tract of land. So Minnesota Valley is well over 14,000 acres, and it goes along more than 70 river miles of the Minnesota River. So it's a very different looking refuge where it's not kind of this self-contained area. It's this really long, windy thing that's kind of broken up into parcels of little skinny areas along the Minnesota River. And so a lot of the habitat looks like this. It would be your floodplain, hardwood forest. You will get some wetlands in there. They do have some prairie, but typically most of the area is going to look like this. It's going to be those lowlands that flood a lot during the flooding season. And it's great habitat for things like bald eagles. So there's a lot of nesting pairs of bald eagles on the refuge. Part of the refuge is also adjacent to a power plant. So there's constantly warm water rushing out of that in the wintertime. So it's a really popular place to see bald eagles. And you get other species as well. There's over 200 species of birds that come through, amphibians, things like that, beavers. So very good eclectic mix. Now this is a shot from kind of part of that area in Bloomington. And I love this picture because it really encapsulates how strange Minnesota Valley is. So those trees you see in the foreground, that's part of the refuge. The kind of middle parking ramp tiered looking thing you see in the middle is going to be Mall of America, actually, and their parking ramps. Just to the right of that is the airport. And then in the background, the cityscape, that's Minneapolis. So really an urban refuge, really an interesting place to be. And I was fortunate enough to be the visitor center manager for them. So that was my detailee role. And they have a very nice visitor center. So it's kind of similar to ours. It was made in 1990, so kind of same decade that it was planned. I should say the refuge was founded in 1976. So it took a long time for them to be able to get a visitor center like this. But it looks really similar. I mean, even you look at the pollinator gardens they have outside, you could easily mistake it for one of our buildings. And on the inside, they have a lot of really nice exhibits. It's a very large, very long visitor center that was supposed to replicate the flowing of the Minnesota River. That's what the little banners are. So it's got lots of space. They use it for a lot of events. They do groups here. They do a very robust environmental education program. They do have a auditorium similar to us. A big open area for hosting things. What you're seeing here is actually called a pollinator shanty. So one of the lakes in Minneapolis hosts what they call a shanty event, where different groups will make different ice shacks and put them on the lake. Well, we made a pollinator themed one year, and we've kind of been like, well, what do we do with it now? So we keep it in the visitor center. It's actually outside right now, but unfortunately the roof caved in when Minnesota got a bunch of snow a couple weeks back. So it's out of business, but still a very cool addition to the visitor center. And then we have the typical things like they have a gallery. This is the Confluence Gallery, which is done in conjunction with an artistry nonprofit. There's a nice little book nook with a fireplace. Normally this would be a good place for kids to hang out. And then naturally we have a nature store. Now, there is a friends group at Min Valley. There's also a trust. So I told you it was adjacent to the airport. So the airport was actually building a second runway that was going to interfere with the wildlife refuge. And so the airport paid over $20 million as compensation for this. And so that was kept with the trust, which is good that they have that money available because the visitor center has not been open since COVID happened. So the nature store has not had any profits. They've done a few things at some outdoor only events, but they've been really hurting being able to support the refuge as they normally would be with the nature store closed. Because normally it'd be full of people. There'd be lots of visitors, there'd be lots of school groups coming through, but we haven't really been able to have any of that, which kind of raises the question, what did I do during my detail with a visitor center that wasn't open? And the answer is adapt. So this is the outside of the visitor center front doors. We weren't allowed to have anybody in the visitor center. So what we did, and this is what their ranger contact station looked like when I first showed up in late September, they just put a table with all of their brochures outside the front doors and said, look, nobody has to come inside. This is how we're going to do it. So this is our wonderful RV volunteer, Renee, working the front desk. Now, this was late September. I'm wondering if anyone can come up with a possible flaw in this system. They started this in, I think they did summer, and then they were doing it through September.
Hey, Patrick, I have a question, a couple of questions for you.
Yes.
And hope this is, I'm not interrupting in a
No, go ahead.
So one comment was, wow, that's interesting about Minnesota Valley. They didn't, Latitude posted that they didn't even know that place or those places were there and existed. So your
Very
presentation
unique.
is bringing things to light. And then another question is from Jim. Jim Johnson was asking if all the nature stores in wildlife refuges in Minnesota are closed.
I think it varies from refuge to refuge. I'm trying to think if I know of any that are open. I don't think Sherburne has a nature store, but they have partial open days. Trying to think who else I've talked to recently. I do not know. I think it's kind of on a manager to manager basis. So good question.
And then Joan mentioned, answering your question, that the outdoor contact station is very creative, but not so good for the wintertime.
Yeah, nailed it, Joan. So September, this was fine. It was pretty comfortable. Renee was out there wearing short sleeves. But then October came and Minnesota gets cold in October. So all of a sudden, our volunteers are out there shivering because they're freezing cold. And that's not really good for anybody. It's not good for volunteers. It's not good for the visitors. But we kind of felt like our hands were tied. So we had to do some more finagling. And we said, aha, if we just move the desk back like 5 more feet, we can close the exterior doors. People can open them as they come in, and then we'll be a little bit warmer. And that's exactly what we did. We said, hey, the people still aren't in the building. They just went through the entryway, which technically isn't part of it. So we put up our table like 5 feet back. We also added a heater. So that weird looking chimney looking thing you have there is actually part of the pollinator shanty I showed earlier. And we stuck a little buddy heater that you would use for like ice fishing in it. And that was one way we tried to keep our volunteers warm. And it did work for a while. So Jim, our volunteer there, you can see he's got his long sleeve sweatshirt on. He's still kind of cold though. What we found was the building is geothermal, and I forget what the proper term for it is, but basically this part of the visitor center was at the end of the line. So it was pretty cold by the time any kind of heating thing got there. So it was really hard to keep this area warm. So we talked to management. We said, okay, our volunteers are still cold. This isn't really working. And then management said, okay, let's do a repause. So at the time, we were open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays for these ranger contact stations. And they said, we're going to just move to Saturdays, and we're going to have you move one more time to keep the volunteers warm. We'll give you the okay on it. So we moved back to the Book Nook, which has a nice little fireplace. It was a lot warmer. We didn't have to deal with any of the heating issues. So this was good, but if you were to go 20 feet in that direction, you would be at the normal visitor desk. And it was raising a lot of questions with volunteers and visitors on, well, if we can be this far into the building, why can't we just go to the desk? And that's where another issue came up, or I guess progress, is we did a complete remodel of the visitor center. So this was something we didn't think was going to get funded. We thought it would be tied to budget stuff. And we found out in November that, hey, you got approved to do renovations to the building. So all of a sudden, our bathroom goes from being a functional space that we could use for visitors to this, an open area that has been drywalled and needs to be painted, and all the electric wires are hanging out. So we have this area that's functionally about 100 square feet, and we're wondering, what do you even do? How do you have an effective visitor center and contact visitors when you only have 100 square feet to work with? And the answer we came up with was we work with premier outdoor sites. And what I mean by that is, if you took a snapshot of the Long Meadow Lake unit, so that's the unit of the refuge that's closest to the Bloomington Visitor Center, there are 4 places that if people said, where should I go? These are the ones we'd recommend to them the most. Obviously the Visitor Center, an area called the Bass Ponds, the Old Cedar Avenue Bridge, and the Lindale Sorensen Landing. So those were kind of our staging areas. So Bass Ponds, another really unique area, also really close to Mall of America. This is actually a mural painted on the back of a microchip processing factory. So it's kind of meant to show the continuum between the nature that's going in one direction and then kind of the technology that's in another and how they come together. So really cool artist project that was done on the refuge. And this is just the parking lot going into it. But this is what the bass ponds look like. And they're aptly named because in the early 1900s, it was used by a private entity. They dug these so that they could raise sport fish. So bass, crappie, that kind of thing. They're not used for that anymore. It is part of the refuge. You can find fish in there. And one thing that's really cool about the bass ponds is they actually have an active trout stream in them. So brown trout live in this stream. This is just a stone's throw from Mall of America, which it's pretty amazing to say that a species that's as sensitive as trout could live in a stream that's right next to Mall of America. So you can't fish in this one, but just kind of a cool aside. And that fishing is a big part of the bass ponds. And every year, Minnesota Valley would do a fishing derby. So they would invite all of their partner schools to come out, get a free fishing rod, learn the skills of fishing, get to practice in the bass ponds, and then they would do a fish fry afterwards. Now, obviously, we weren't able to do that due to COVID, but we were able to do a couple of things that were kind of in that same realm during my detail. And the first was we did still have some education groups out. So this far off photo is actually me with some 8th graders. So the refuge had just taken on a new partner school with a charter school called Partnership Academy, which is a primarily Spanish speaking charter school. So we went out with a group of 8th graders and did some intro to bird watching, which the bass ponds are excellent places for bird watching because you've got those ponds on one side and on the other is a very prolonged wetland known as Long Meadow Lake. We also did some public bird watching as well. So there's an excellent birder named Craig Mendel who's been a volunteer for the Refuge for years. And he leads intro bird walks and then very advanced bird walks as well. So I think this was one of the advanced bird walks, but this was one earlier in the season. So that's why nobody's social distancing or wearing a mask. I did go on one of the advanced ones with Craig, but it was in a unseasonably cold October where with wind chills, it was like 1 degree. And I don't think I had any more than just like light gloves. So I was not whipping out my phone to take pictures, but those have been really effective ways to get people engaged at these sites, despite the cold. Because the waterfall is great. Next on our list is a very interesting one, Old Cedar Avenue Bridge. So back in the day, this bridge used to be what vehicles would take to get across the river. Now it has since been rebuilt elsewhere and the bridge has kind of fallen into disrepair. So the whole area is kind of shady, literally. It's overgrown with trees. There's lots of vandalism, lots of dumping. So it's not really a popular place for people to go to, unless you're a birder. Birders love it because it is in that adjacent area to Long Meadow Lake. There's lots of cover and most other people don't go. So you're not going to get people scaring the birds away. But it honestly wasn't a great place for the refuge, especially since the community they're trying to work with is adjacent to this area. So they said, we're going to try to redo it and make it better. So the bridge got rebuilt. It's only open to pedestrians now. It's a very attractive, very cool bridge that gets a lot of foot traffic. And here's a zoom out of what the area looks like. So it's been completely redone. A lot of that overgrowth has been cut out. They've made a much more accessible parking lot. There's a picnic pavilion. And then one of my favorites, a nature play area. So if you're not familiar, a nature play area is kind of like a playground that doesn't have like structural equipment like a jungle gym or a swing set. Instead, it has things like logs, rocks, sticks, stumps, things that kind of bridge that gap and teach kids, hey, nature's fun. You don't need like something to climb on or a slide to have fun in nature. Like it provides the fun stuff for you. So a very cool spot. This was used during COVID. It was actually very popular. And the artwork you're seeing was actually used for a different event, but they liked it so much that they kept it. So Nancy, I'd love to get one of these for Neal Smith, although I don't think Scott would go for it. So during the detail, they actually did do an event at the Old Cedar Avenue Bridge. So they did a reopening event. Now, this was late September. At the time, Fish and Wildlife couldn't host events with more than 50 people. So this is actually a joint event. So the land is partially owned by the city of Bloomington. So this ended up being their event. And then the refuge was just there as participants. So that's kind of how they got around the being able to do an event during the time of COVID. But it was very successful. More than, I think, what do we count? 300 people came throughout the day. They had food trucks, live music. It was a cool event. And then now we're doing snowshoeing events at Old Cedar Avenue. So we do advanced signups. So like I was supposed to give one on Saturday, but it was so cold that we had to cancel because doing an intro event for people who have never been out before when it's 15 below is not a great introduction. I'm going to pause there for a second because I think I see chats.
Yes, Patrick, yes, some comments on the playscape or the nature playground. And says, Robert said, yeah, wow, that all looks awesome. And then Joan says, we do need this at the refuge. And I've been dropping little seeds of encouragement to both Karen and Scott about a playscape or a nature playground. So maybe someday.
Wear them down.
Yeah, just keep planting the seeds. just keep trying. But yeah, it's,
Yeah.
I had the fortunate, I shadowed some folks up there at Minnesota Valley, and I got to go see some of those places. And especially that bridge was just such an awesome place for people just to bike and walk and fish, and just real, and it's phenomenal because right down the road is the Mall of America. So it's right there in the middle of urbanness, and just a fantastic place. It's well worth the visit.
Yeah. And I love that dichotomy between the like wild natural and then like it's a great place for families to go. And you don't have to be a nature expert to go there. You just want to play on some logs with your kids. That's great. All right. Last place, Sorensen Landing. Now, traditionally, this was a pretty neglected place. All it was a boat access to the Minnesota River on part of the refuge land. Uh, and it was a jointly held area with the city of Bloomington and the DNR as well. So it was kind of hard knowing who was in charge. There wasn't a whole lot to look at, lots of dumping. But that has changed drastically in that it's become a really big hotspot for cyclists, in particular off-road cyclists or fat tire cyclists. One reason being that a state trail, the Minnesota Valley State Trail, which goes from further down southwest all the way up towards like Fort Snelling, which is north of the refuge, they decided to put in a paved area of this. So that phase 1A construction you see there is actually a paved trail. So aside from the people who just want to do fat tire biking off like dirt tracks, this is a great place for people who are like with strollers or little kids. And we did some guided tours of this. We actually did a hike with some of our volunteers, and then we did some fat tire biking programs. Actually went on a fat tire bike for the first time. It's very fun, although if you go on sidewalk or go on like an incline, you will want to die. I did add in a bonus one. So my duties as visitor center manager were mostly working with volunteers, finding programs for people to do offsite, that kind of thing. But my personal favorite was the bird feeder station, which is right outside the visitor center. And mainly because these 3 turkeys would come up every time. You'd walk out with a bin full of seed, and they would come running out of the woods, just ready for you, just didn't even care. And they were just the cutest things ever. And we had a few come with families once, and then they were just so fun being able to jump up on the feeders. Loved them, loved turkeys. So that was a hip fire, as Scott would say, of my detail at Minnesota Valley.